You close the book of Malachi and the world is Persian. Prophets speak with divine authority. The temple stands in Jerusalem, and the people of Israel exist as a distinct, though subject, community under a distant emperor. Then you open the Gospel of Matthew. The language has shifted from Hebrew to Greek. The political power is no longer Persian but Roman, with legions stationed in the land. The religious landscape is fractured into competing sects: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, each with a different vision for what redemption should look like. The temple has been rebuilt on a colossal scale by a half-Jewish client king infamous for his paranoia and brutality. What happened in the 4 centuries between these two testaments? Tradition labels this the period of prophetic silence, a 400-year gap where the voice of God, as recorded in Scripture, goes quiet. But silence is a misnomer. These were not quiet years. They were centuries of violent upheaval, cultural revolution, and political catastrophe that fundamentally reshaped the world into which Jesus of Nazareth was born. The absence of a prophetic voice did not mean an absence of divine activity. Instead, it intensified a desperate, collective longing for a word from God, setting a stage meticulously prepared through conquest and collision. The transition began not with a gradual shift, but with the explosive force of a single individual, Alexander the Great. In 334 BC, this young Macedonian king crossed into Asia Minor and began a conquest that would, in little over a decade, dismantle the Persian Empire and spread Greek culture from the shores of the Mediterranean to the borders of India. For the Jewish people living in the province of Judea, the change of imperial overseer from Persia to Greece might have seemed like a simple political transaction. But Alexander brought something far more transformative than a new tax collector. He brought Hellenism. Hellenization was the deliberate imposition of Greek language, philosophy, architecture, and social customs. The Greek language, specifically the common Koine Greek spoken across the empire, became the lingua franca of commerce, administration, and intellectual life. This linguistic unification had a profound theological consequence: the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. This work, known as the Septuagint, made the God of Israel accessible to the entire Greco-Roman world for the first time, creating the linguistic vehicle the early Christian movement would later use to spread its message. The pressure of Hellenism created a deep cultural fault line within Jewish society. In cities like Jerusalem, a progressive, urban elite embraced Greek ways. They built gymnasiums, institutions centered on athletic competition performed in the nude, a direct affront to Jewish modesty, and engaged with Greek philosophy. This created a stark division between those who saw Hellenism as modernity and progress, and those who viewed it as an existential threat to covenantal identity. The Greek intellectual framework, with its focus on logic, reason, and abstract concepts like the logos, would later provide the philosophical vocabulary for figures like the Apostle John to explain the nature of Christ to a Gentile world. Alexander's conquests, therefore, did not just change the map. They changed the very mental and spiritual categories through which truth would be communicated. The political aftermath of Alexander's sudden death saw his empire fractured among his generals. Judea fell under the control of the Seleucid dynasty, based in Syria. For a time, a tense coexistence persisted, but the crisis reached its zenith under the reign of Antiochus IV, who audaciously took the title Epiphanes, meaning, God manifest. Antiochus was a zealot for Hellenism, and he embarked on a systematic campaign to eradicate the Jewish religion, seeing its particularity as an obstacle to imperial unity. His actions were a calculated assault on the core pillars of Jewish faith. He outlawed central practices: circumcision, the observance of the Sabbath, and the study of Torah. The ultimate desecration came in 167 BC when he entered the temple in Jerusalem, offered a pig, a ritually unclean animal, upon the altar, and erected a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies. This event, memorialized in the Book of Daniel as the abomination of desolation, was more than an insult. It was a theological declaration of war, a profanation intended to demonstrate the superiority of Greek gods over the God of Israel. The response was not a quiet prayer for deliverance, but a violent uprising. In the village of Modin, a priest named Mattathias, when ordered to offer a pagan sacrifice, killed both a Jewish collaborator and the Seleucid official, rallying his sons and followers to the hills. The rebellion was led by his son, Judas, who earned the nickname Maccabeus, the Hammer. Against overwhelming odds, this guerrilla army used knowledge of the terrain and hit-and-run tactics to defeat the professional Seleucid forces in a series of stunning victories. The climax was the recapture and cleansing of the temple in 164 BC, an event commemorated by the festival of Hanukkah, the dedication. The Maccabean revolt resulted in a brief period of Jewish independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. But the victory contained the seeds of its own corruption. The Hasmonean rulers, who began as priests fighting for religious freedom, gradually adopted the very Hellenistic trappings of kingship they had opposed. They conquered neighboring territories, and internal power struggles fractured the nation. It was from this crucible of corrupted liberation that the main Jewish sects emerged. The Pharisees emphasizing strict adherence to the law, the Sadducees representing the temple aristocracy, and the Essenes withdrawing into the desert in protest. The crisis under Antiochus had forged a new, more complex and tense, religious reality. The fragile independence won by the Maccabees could not withstand the rising power from the west. Internal strife within the Hasmonean dynasty provided the pretext for Rome's entry. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey, invited to mediate a civil war, instead marched his legions into Jerusalem and entered the temple's Holy of Holies, a symbolic act declaring Judea's subjection. Jewish self-rule was over. Judea was now a client kingdom of the Roman Republic, and later, the Roman Empire. This subjugation came with a paradox: the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Enforced by the brutal efficiency of the legions, this peace eliminated piracy, suppressed large-scale banditry, and created a stability unknown in the region for centuries. Rome's greatest contribution to the stage of salvation history was its infrastructure. An extensive network of durable roads, built for military logistics, now connected the empire from Britain to Egypt. Safe sea lanes, protected from pirates, facilitated trade and travel. A universal system of law and a common currency allowed for unprecedented mobility. For a message intended to go to all nations, the Roman world provided the first truly global delivery system. The face of Roman authority in Judea was Herod the Great, appointed by the Roman Senate as King of the Jews. A master politician and brilliant architect, Herod was also a paranoid tyrant who murdered his own family members whom he perceived as threats. To legitimize his rule, he embarked on a colossal project: the expansion and beautification of the temple in Jerusalem. The result was one of the magnificent structures of the ancient world, a project so vast that it was still under construction during Jesus' lifetime. Yet this grandeur was a facade masking a deep tension. The Herodian dynasty, though Jewish in name, was ultimately an instrument of Roman power, its authority resting on the threat of crucifixion, Rome's ultimate instrument of terror and public control. The Pax Romana was not a gentle peace. It was a peace secured by a cross, a symbol that would be redefined by the events of the first century. By the first century, the religious landscape Jesus encountered was the direct product of these centuries of turmoil. The central institutions and factions were all shaped by the response to foreign domination and the absence of prophetic guidance. The most significant development was the rise of the synagogue. With the temple controlled by a collaborating aristocracy and often distant for many Jews, the synagogue became the local center of Jewish life. It was a place of prayer, scripture reading, and community instruction, decentralizing religious practice and creating a people of the book, ready for a message not solely dependent on temple sacrifice. The sects represented divergent paths for a people under pressure. The Pharisees emerged as the teachers of the people, focusing on the meticulous application of the Torah to everyday life through an expanding oral law. Their emphasis on resurrection, angels, and divine providence shaped the piety of the common person. In contrast, The Sadducees were the aristocratic party, centered on the temple priesthood. They rejected the newer doctrines of the Pharisees, collaborating with Roman authorities to maintain their power and privilege. Withdrawing entirely were the Essenes, who saw both the temple and the world as corrupt. Communities like the one at Qumran, which produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, lived in apocalyptic expectation, preparing in the desert for God's imminent war against evil. This fragmentation produced a diversity of messianic expectation. Some, remembering the Maccabees, awaited a warrior king who would overthrow Rome. Others, influenced by prophetic texts, looked for a suffering servant. Some expected a priestly Messiah, others a prophetic one like Moses. The common thread was a desperate, intensified longing for God to act. The 400 years of silence had amplified the hunger for a word from God to a fever pitch. It was into this world of prepared language, open roads, and fervent expectation that the voice of John the Baptist suddenly erupted in the wilderness, breaking the silence and declaring the arrival of the kingdom. The convergence was complete. The Greek language provided the vocabulary, the Roman roads the pathway, and 4 centuries of refined longing the receptive heart. The stage was not set by accident, but by the intricate movements of empires and the faithful preservation of a people. When the text resumes in the Gospel of Matthew, it is because the world had finally been made ready. The silence was over. The fullness of time had come.